environmental change, degradation, and hazards were given as the primary reason for moving. And in Tuvalu, the figure was 9%. So, of course, people move for work and education, but increasingly the environment and climate change are interacting and causing people to move. Now, people in the Pacific generally move within their countries. They might move to another island. Sometimes they want to move internationally, and this does happen, but these types of movements tend to be rather restricted by, firstly, the money to be able to move. It costs money to move, of course, but then also the permission, so the permits and visas that are necessary to actually move to Australia or New Zealand, for example. And we found that in the period of 2005 to 2015, approximately 10% of the population in the three countries wanted to move but were unable to move. So when options are constrained, the type of movements might not be sustainable. They might not be adaptive movements. So in Kiribati, for example, most of the movements which are occurring, and especially those ones which are triggered by environmental change, they tend to be to the capital, to South Tarawa. And in Tarawa, it's a place which is already rather overpopulated, and it has challenges with access to water, sanitation. So what we have happening is increased flows into the capital. This is people moving for the normal reasons for urbanization, but also climate change-related impacts. And we've projected that by the middle of the century, the population could increase by 70%. So what we could see here is a possible triple risk related to climate change. So firstly, the exposure for the people living in such islands is increasing because of climate change intensifying hazards and hazards occurring more frequently. And this population could become more vulnerable if their livelihoods are affected by access to water, for example. And thirdly, the population is growing also. So this is a triple risk. It's happening now, and it's likely to get worse in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And now I'd like to give the floor to Wesley Morgan.
Thank you. And apologies if I cover some of the same points as my colleague Robert here. In Pacific Island countries, communities are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. People in the Pacific rely on local resources to provide for their food and housing requirements and are faced with impacts that threaten their livelihoods, including sea level rise, but also coral bleaching and more intense cyclones. I mean, there's a whole host of impacts, but these are some of the impacts that are starting to bite. Island communities have deep connections with their land and oceans, and relocation is generally considered an option of last resort. Nonetheless, for some communities, the only way to adapt to climate change is to move. And the first point to make about that is that forced displacement as a result of human-induced climate change represents in itself a breach of fundamental human rights. But if displacement is the only option for some communities, it is important that both national and regional policy frameworks are established that allow those communities to relocate in a way that respects their human rights and acknowledges their essential human dignity. It is also important to recognise the existing capacities and strengths of Pacific Island communities. In many places, custom and indigenous systems of governance are the key sources of resilience in the face of a whole range of challenges, including but not limited to the impacts of climate change. We've seen this recently in Vanuatu, for example, where just last month 11,000 people needed to be relocated from the island of Ambai, not due to the impacts of climate change, but due to risks posed by an active volcano. In this case, the resilience of Pacific communities was on display. People did not wait for government support or international aid agencies to evacuate the island. Communities across the Vanuatu archipelago helped to organize inter-island barges and boats and began to send water, food, bedding and other essentials. On nearby island, communities readied themselves to receive the people of Ambae. Incidences like these remind us of the inherent resilience of island communities, and they highlight that any national and regional framework around climate-induced migration needs to take into account the existing strengths and local contexts within Pacific Island countries. It's also important to stress that migration and short-term movement abroad for employment and education is vitally important for many communities in Pacific Islands. This can be considered somewhat separately from the issue of climate-induced displacement or forced relocation. Diaspora communities in other parts of the Pacific, including in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, but around the world, are very important for communities back home. They provide remittances that are crucial sources of cash income. Each year, tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders also travel abroad for short-term employment. For example, working in seasonal employment opportunities in horticulture and agriculture in Australia and New Zealand. These opportunities, or schemes for short-term work abroad, are not without their issues and could be improved, particularly if they create new opportunities for women to participate, work more closely with trade unions and others to develop robust safeguards to prevent exploitation in these seasonal schemes. But nonetheless, migration and short-term employment abroad can be argued to be a source of resilience for many island communities, helping them to better adapt to changes wrought by climate change. So, to reiterate, forced displacement of communities is a deeply challenging problem. In many parts of the Pacific, the prospect of displacement presents a threat to the homes and lived cultures of Pacific Islanders. Where communities do face displacement, and are likely to in the future, it is vitally important that regional policy frameworks are established that allow those communities to relocate in a way that respects their human rights. For the most vulnerable island communities, particularly those on low-lying atolls, policymakers are obliged to plan now for migration with dignity, to create pathways for people to relocate if they need to and if they desire in an orderly fashion. But, and this is my last point, in the ways we frame these discussions, we must also be careful to retain a space for hope. The most straightforward way to ensure Pacific Island communities are able to stay in their homes, to retain their connections to land and ocean and to each other, is to take strong and determined action to deal with the root causes of climate change. Of course, the 2015 Paris Agreement is in itself a major diplomatic achievement, but to meet the goals of the agreement and limit global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees above the long-term average will require a massive transformation of the global economy. Governments and businesses must make decisions now that will see them move away from fossil fuels as a source of energy. But there is still hope that if governments are willing to do that, if they are willing to make the decisions needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, many Pacific Island communities will remain rooted in their land and in their cultures for generations to come.
Thank you very much, Wesley. Last up, Cosmin, who's also the author of the report that we're launching today.
Thank you, Janine, and thank you for being here to all of you. In the last couple of years, United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, together with AXA Research Fund, conducted a project in the Pacific Islands, targeting Fiji and Vanuatu, looking and focusing on the two systems of law available at place. And the research used a qualitative methodology and talked to experts, government representatives, church leaders, households, owners, and it showed the discrepancies of the two legal systems of law which are in place. The research also emphasize the need when it's coming, when we are talking about migration. We cannot talk today about migration without relating to human rights, and we cannot talk about migration and human rights without relating to climate change. This relationship, this interconnection, which is growing slowly but surely, unfortunately, it's projected in the communities and in the communities' needs, which are not necessarily satisfied by the laws at place. The two systems of law the research focused on are the domestic one, which we are familiar with, like the national legislation, and the community law, which is also known as the custom law. And sometimes in some parts of the Pacific, the custom law is much stronger than the national legislation. So in spite of the political momentum we had in 2015 when we signed and ratified the Paris Agreement, the research shows that it's quite hard to implement the Paris Agreement in a very efficient and successful way at community law, as far as these two systems of law do not complement each other. It's useless to say that sometimes international pieces of law which are important in national legislations do not reach the people. This is a fact, unfortunately, which is reflected as well in regards to the Paris Agreement in the Pacific Islands. And it shows the need of changing the policy approach from a top-bottom approach to a bottom-up approach, where the community law is also considered when we are trying to import that piece of international law. The also research emphasized, as my colleagues here said, the regional approach as a necessity in order to regulate migration in relation to climate change, with a human rights approach in mind as well. The regional approach is the research shows that the regional approach is much more efficient, mainly because it conserves the values and traditions of the specific region, in this particular case the Pacific Islands, rather to waiting for a slow political process which is happening at the global level. And also emphasize the need of the countries to come together, mainly because, again, the individual capacities of the states is quite limited when we are talking and when we are referring to human resources or financial resources. Also the regional approach in regulating migration today in the Pacific will avoid some humanitarian crises which can be shown in the future, and we don't need to wait for this crisis to appear when we can have these preventive measures taken in place and emphasize and looking at the people's needs and what they are looking for when they are coming to a new society. We already know that most of the people do not want to move. However, if necessary, when that process will happen, we have to take in considerations their needs and their values, traditions, cultures, as well as the impact on the new hosting society's labor market, accessing the medical resources or their new educational systems. In order to all create all these this flawless trajectory for migrants from one island to another, when we are talking all the internal migration was exhausted, we have to think as well as the human rights approach with a strong human rights language. For some countries in the region, according to the research we conducted, is not very well known. They are not very familiarized with human rights concept, and they are as well quite reluctant at community level. Again, they are quite reluctant importing human rights concepts and human rights values when they do not necessarily know what they are about. The report it's emphasizing the legal need for this regional approach towards migration, as well as a need for the governments to consider the harmonizations of the two systems of law domestically which are in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. We would now like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, state your name and the media outlet that you represent. Are there any questions from the audience? Then we have been either terribly clear or terribly unclear. Yes, please, the gentleman.
So you Yeah, so you mentioned, hi, my name is Sujay, and not with a press, but with universities, University of Oxford. And one question is, you mentioned there's a difference between domestic law and community law. So, like, you know, to what extent is it different? And like, can you give examples of that? And have there been any attempts to try and harmonize those two so far by the government?
Are there any other questions? We can take 2 or 3 at the same time. Okay, then we'll get going with this one. Thank you.
The governments work hardly to harmonize the two systems of law. However, the examples are there, and the report we just launched today is referring to a human rights violation. And for example, the example of torture. Most of the countries in the world, not necessarily most of them, but some of them already ratified the Convention Against Torture, and some Pacific Islands are some countries which already ratified and signed the Convention Against Torture. However, this is not reflective at the community level, where the leadership of the community, the chief of the clan, tribe, family, or regardless of what kind of societal structures they have in place, shows that sometimes an aggressive or violent behavior, it's requested, it's needed, and is also very well accepted by the community as a way of expressing the leadership, the respective leadership. So you have a government which, from its own perspective, did the best it could do in order to import that specific law. However, it is not reflected, mainly because the strength of the custom it's much more present than the government legal approach.
Thank you, Cosmin. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is John Watts. I work for The Guardian newspaper. How much support is there amongst nations in the region for this kind of regional approach that you're suggesting? And is it the case that perhaps the smaller islands are pushing for more rapid change, and maybe the bigger countries like Australia and New Zealand are more reluctant to get involved at this level? I appreciate that's a political question, but would you be able to address that? Thank you.
Well, during the research we conducted in the last 2 years, we had a lot of meetings and we organized some workshops with government representatives in the region. And we have the support of those respective governments in relation to elaborating a regional framework on migration. We did not talk to Australia and New Zealand, to be precisely answering to your question. However, the need is there, and the governments see the urgency of having this process, which is growing day by day, somehow regulated in the region. And yeah, this is it.
I teach political science, and perhaps I can address the politics of the question a little. In the region, there are cooperation between Pacific Island countries and metropolitan powers with regards to migration. French territories in the Pacific, Pacific territories that have close arrangements with the United States. Communities do have pathways for migration abroad. There's really only a handful of atoll states, or to be precise, there's Tuvalu and Kiribati that don't have pathways for outward migration. And, august institutions like the World Bank, for example, have recommended that Australia and New Zealand consider an atoll access category visa to allow people from Tuvalu and Kiribati to migrate to New Zealand and Australia. And I think that policymakers in Australia perhaps this is a sensitive question, but they are certainly thinking about how they deal with it. And it's not going to go away that as key neighbours to Pacific Island countries, they have responsibilities to people in the region.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? In this case, we'll conclude the press briefing. Thanks so much for coming. If you have interest of speaking with any one of the panelists right after, we'll still be in the room for a while and happy to chat. Thanks very much.